Hello, I'm Dr. Agnes Trokiana, neurologist, quite often called Dr. Be Well. I'm based in Devon, UK. Surrounded by the beauty of this coastline, the idea for the Be Well with MS podcast was born here. Inspired by science, grounded in wellness, this videocast is here to guide and empower you on your journey with multiple sclerosis, or simply to help you live a healthier and more balanced life. Join me as we inspire and explore practical science-based tools, uplifting stories, and ways to thrive together. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another enlightening episode of Be Well with MS, living above and below the threshold, brain reserve, and MS. I'm your host, Dr. Agnes Trokiana, neurologist, and today I'm absolutely thrilled to bring you a very special guest, a person who has been an inspiration, a role model, quite frankly, a bit of a celebrity in MS world. Let me set the stage. About 10 years ago, when I was just starting out as a research and clinical fellow working in MS with Professor Jeremy Hoggart, I came across the neurologist's brilliant educational work on Medscape. Medscape is one of the educational platforms. Prof. Krieger's clarity, wit, and passion for teaching left me in, fast forward a few years, and there I was sitting at the same table as him, a fellow scientific advisor, pinching myself because I couldn't believe I am here with him. And then this year, at the AAN, one of the American neurology meetings in Denver, I finally met him face to face. Now, let me officially introduce Professor Krieger. He's a professor of neurology at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, where he practices at the Corinne Goldsmith Dickinson Center for MS. He completed his MD at Yale University after graduating from Columbia College and his neurology residency at Mount Sinai, followed by a fellowship in multiple sclerosis at the same institution. Professor Krieger has been a pivotal figure in the MS community, not only for his clinical and research work, but also for his contribution to education. He's the creator of the innovative topographical model of MS, which has transformed how we conceptualize the MS disease. He also a mentor, a award-winning educator, and fun fact, he's a model. He recently walked the runway at New York Fashion Week to support MS awareness and research. In today's episode, we are diving into the fascinating concept of brain reserve, how the structural and anatomical features of brain create resilience against neurodegenerative conditions like one of them, MS. We will explore how this reserve can delay the onset of symptoms, what it means to live above and below the threshold, and how lifestyle choices can help protect and enhance your brain health. Stephen will also share practical tips for preserving brain reserve and often insights on the future of MS care and research. It's my honor and absolute pleasure to welcome the brilliant, the inspiring, and undeniably stylish Dr. Stephen Krieger to Be Well with MS podcast. Thank you for joining me today.
I'm delighted to join you, but there's no way I'm going to be able to live up to half of that introduction for your listening audience. So I think you need to set expectations much lower for them. But at least with an audio podcast, no one will confuse me for an actual model. So that part I think we can set aside. That was an absolutely terrifying little bit of fundraising and awareness raising for MS in New York. Will probably never happen again. So I'm glad you mentioned it. That was a one-time only sort of modeling performance.
Well done, Stephen. I think I hope that next year you're going to be back walking down on the stage on the runaway and maybe presenting a different costume, maybe day-to-day Professor Krieger's costume and suit.
Maybe. I think I'm more likely to keep my day job as an MS neurologist. I think I'm probably better suited to it. Thank you so much for having me and for having me to talk about reserve and resilience and the topographical model. That is my contribution. It's every good idea I've ever had in one place, and the whole idea of it is to help explain MS and to make it clear for people living with it and the people who love them and take care of them, and to try to foster an idea of empowerment with brain reserve. So I think it's kind of the perfect topic for Be Well, and I'm really glad to be here to talk to you about it.
I'm honored to have you, and it's a great, great pleasure, Stephen. So maybe let's dive into the resilience. The way I was thinking about the topic and the title for this episode. I was thinking reserve is like, it has got some sort of I don't know, but I think that the literature and the research is focused, and this is the definition that is being used to tell about the capacity of the brain in a way. I like the word more capacity, but I think from the science perspective and research perspective, the resilience makes more sense. So, Stephen, maybe if you could explain what is the brain reserve and what does it matter for people living with MS?
Sure. I mean, I think in simplest terms, the idea of brain reserve is that any one spot in the brain is sort of doing a thousand things. And everything that we do is done and created by a thousand different parts of the brain at once. So there was this old idea that one spot in the brain does one particular thing. And if you lose that spot, that ability, that skill is gone. And that the brain doesn't grow back and doesn't heal itself. And it turns out all of that is wrong, that really the brain behaves much more like a distributed network. And that gives it an incredible ability, of course, to do everything that the brain can do, but also to compensate for any damage that might happen to that network, that capacity to work around things so that it continues to accomplish what the brain sets out to do. I have a lot of different metaphors for this that I use, the topographical model being kind of the most thorough one, which I think we'll get to. But let me throw a couple of simpler ones in to kind of get us started. When you think of a network, I think a cell phone network is a great metaphor for this. So a cell phone network allows all of our phones to work, and it's built on thousands and thousands of cell phone towers all around the world that keep that network going. And if one cell phone tower falls over, nobody loses phone service. It doesn't turn off all the phones in some particular area because that network just shifts to one of the thousands of other cell phone towers. That is to say, one could have lots of those cell phone towers fall over, and no one would realize it. No one would know because the network would compensate. And in neurologic conditions and in MS, any one lesion in any one spot is typically so well compensated. The system works around them that a person may never feel those lesions. They may never cause anything that the person would know about. That is to say, it wouldn't cause anything above some threshold of awareness, some threshold where the person feels a symptom or manifests some sort of neurologic sign. Most of the lesions in the brain that happen in MS go under that threshold. They would be imperceptible because of the brain's capacity for reserve, its plasticity, and its ability to heal itself. So that's my sort of first metaphor for it. Let me throw one more, and then we'll see what you think. Another one
Mhm.
is similar concept, but you can imagine the brain as this with this incredible flow of data and information happening in all sorts of directions, this huge flux of information. I always kind of imagine like the matrix screen with all the little digital stuff flying all in all directions. Well, imagine that in more literal terms, like a literal stream, right? You're standing at the side of a stream, and that stream is flowing past you with all that water being the metaphor for all that information passing through the nervous system. And then somewhere upstream from you, there's some kids standing by the side of that river, tossing little pebbles into that river. And those kids can toss all sorts of pebbles into that river, but you, half a mile downstream, you would never know because the water just flows around all those little obstructions, all those little pebbles in that stream. And downstream from that, you'd have no idea that that's happening under the surface. Now, we still don't want the kids to fill the entire riverbed with stones, right? Eventually, that could block the river, and then the water or the signals wouldn't get through. But part of the reserve, part of that capacity is the ability to flow around all those little pebbles. And I think that's why the brain is such a resilient thing, that the signals that it's conducting can flow around all those little obstructions, all those little lesions. We care about them, but the brain has an incredible ability to compensate and keep that below the threshold.
Amazing analogies that you've been describing here. I think in such a beautiful way, Stephen. I really, really enjoyed that, and I think it will resonate and with many people who are listening to this episode. And I think if we bring that into more science, research indicates that individuals with higher brain reserve, often measured through metrics such as intracranial volume, and exhibit slower progression of disability and cognitive decline compared to those with lower reserve. So, and I think it's such an important message. How can we keep that volume of the brain? How can we utilize our cognitive processes to cope with the damage, and how important it is? I think one of the symptoms that people with MS report is fatigue. Um, and I think and how brain copes with that fatigue or any other MS symptom. And just to add to the whole analogy, I think I like analogy describing as a brain reserve as a sort of a brain saving account, the structural and anatomical wealth that provides a buffer against the tough times. Like, you know, if there is a degenerative process and brain volume loss in patient with MS, so just like savings account cushions the during the financial hardships. So the greater the reserve, the more neurons, the more synapses, and the more overall brain volume that can better absorb the impact of the challenges such as multiple sclerosis.
I think you're right. I like the savings account example also, but what can I say? I guess I shy away from money-based metaphors and I go for all sorts of natural things like streams and networks. And when we get to the topographical model, it's a pool, which is, of course, ironic because I'm really not much of a swimmer. I've never owned a pool. I don't have a pool, but the idea, I think, hopefully will resonate. But you're absolutely right that when we have thought about reserve in neurology and in neuroscience, typically we have paired the word reserve with the idea of cognitive reserve. I think cognitive reserve is what we kind of intuitively recognize, and that is to say, we can do more cognitively and we can do more with our highest brain functions than we are called upon to do on a day-to-day basis. We have cognitive reserve. We have abilities beyond the routine things that we do typically. Um, what my colleague at Mount Sinai, Jim Samowski, who's a neuropsychologist, has really done with the reserve concept is to say what's true in cognition, that the fact that we have this additional capacity to do more and to compensate is also true in other neurological domains. So he extended the concept of cognitive reserve into brain reserve more broadly, and I really give him a lot of credit for this work. It's his work that originally found that the larger the brain volume, the greater the reserve there seems to be against later decline. That was true in the Alzheimer world, which he'd worked in earlier, and he brought that concept into multiple sclerosis. And and I think functionally, we can imagine reserve in other domains. So for instance, when we walk down the street, for instance, our walking is sort of somewhat automatic, right? We start a little program going that says, do the walking thing, and then walking occurs. We don't think about every step. But when we're challenged, for instance, walking on a balance beam or walking on the edge of a curb, right? Or walking on a rainy day in high winds while carrying bags, all of a sudden the task of walking is now being challenged a great deal more. And if one has physical reserve, balance reserve in that capacity, one can draw upon those things to still be able to accomplish it. It's true even for something like dexterity. On a given day, we may be typing, we may be writing, we may be doing things that, require a little bit of dexterity. But someone who can then sit down at the piano and, play Rachmaninoff has such vastly more developed skills and reserve of dexterity and physical nuance that they could draw upon when called upon to do so. And so what Jim Samowski has done is create challenging tasks both for cognition and for balance, also for strength. We're not using our maximal strength most of the time during a day. And so one can think of brain reserve across all domains. And we need, as clinicians who take care of people with MS, we need to look harder. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that, but we need to look harder to really understand someone's abilities, the extent of their reserve, and the way MS might challenge that. And brain volume is a good start. It's a good metric to look at it with imaging to say, how full is someone's brain? And how can we work with them to optimize the fullness of that brain, the fullness of their reserve over the lifespan to protect them against decline?
Yeah. I'm listening to you, Stephen, and thinking it applies to human beings, not just people affected with MS. You know,
Right.
so we all should pursue our lives doing activities that enhances our brain reserve or brain capacity, whether it's listening to the music, playing music, imaginary life can enhance that function of our brain, or doing some physical work, or doing exercise, or we'll come to that sort of a lifestyle approach. But I think it applies not just people with MS, but I think to any human being on this earth. And I'm just sort of trying to understand and look for some examples, how the brain reserve protects us. What are the visible effects in people with MS?
So, I think the most overt way is that reserve in the brain's hemispheres, right? The major structures in the brain uh, is so good at allowing people to not notice when they have lesions, for instance, because they can do so much more. There's so much more plasticity. And by that, I mean ability to work around and find new pathways to get the signals to where they need to go. But not all structures in the nervous system have the same amount of reserve. So the brain hemispheres are these big, vast networks. But let's say our motor abilities, we have to start by thinking of what we want to do. We create a motor path. That motor instruction follows that path down through the brain, through the brainstem, and then out into the spinal cord, where then it travels out into the limbs to create movement, to tell the muscles what to do. But in order to get there, that signal has to pass through the base of the brain into the spinal cord and then outwards to the limbs. So that spinal cord, that narrow structure, sort of the width of the base of your thumb, is carrying all of that information to and from the brain. It is, in essence, a very narrow pathway. Or to use a kind of New York-based metaphor, since I am here in New York City, it's very high value real estate, that area, the spinal cord itself. And so the spinal cord has less reserve than the brain. It has less regions where you can call upon other structures. It has less ability to create new pathways and workarounds because it is this tiny little tube of wires carrying all that information to and from the brain to the body. So lesions in the brain may cause no symptoms because the brain compensates so beautifully. Lesions in the spinal cord, however, can cut some of those pathways. And then there's not a lot of workarounds. And so there's less reserve in the spinal cord, for instance, and lesions there are more likely to cause symptoms, weakness, numbness, walking problems, bladder problems, etc. Because there's not as much reserve in that area because it is so small, so tight, and so compact there's so little redundancy in a sense. So I think reserve is incredibly important in the nervous system for all people. It's important in MS, but the next step is realizing that not all parts of our nervous system have it to the same degree, and that's why certain areas that are vulnerable to MS lesions, like the spinal cord or the optic nerve, the nerve to the eye, are so much more likely to cause symptoms. Similarly, the optic nerve is just a wire. Really, there's not a lot of workarounds there too, less reserve. So if there's a lesion in the optic nerve, that person was much more likely to experience vision loss. If there's a lesion in the spinal cord, they're much more likely to experience numbness or weakness, the things that we know about. And so this is going to inform what the topographical model is about when we talk about that.
Mm-hmm. And for instance, research has shown that cortical atrophy is predominantly observed in primary progressive MS, whilst like a central more ventricular brain atrophy is more characterized in relapsing and remitting. So different types would have a different anatomy changes, which is also a fascinating feature. But at the same time, we know that there is a proportion of people who have all these different lesions in the different territories, including spine, and they're not presenting with any symptom. So maybe it's time to look at your topography and topographical model of MS, and that has been a game changer. It was something that first time I read your article, I was like, oh my god, this is this is this is game changing. This is real, and we never thought this way. We just been advised by FDA and pharmaceutical companies to phenotype MS, but we never gone above and below the topography and lesion distribution. What does that mean in general? Maybe for our layperson audience, topography model of MS, what is it? And maybe then we'll talk about above and below the threshold of the topographical model.
Sure. Well, I'm glad it moved you, and the ideas of it are really they are simple, and I think they are a way in to understanding how MS behaves. So the topographical model just takes everything we've been talking about and visualizes it. It makes it something that people could look at. So everything we've said so far, reserve is important, compensates for damage. There's a threshold above which we see the signs and symptoms of the disease, and below which there are lesions that may not have caused symptoms. And that there's more reserve and capacity for resilience in the hemispheres of the brain, less as the brain narrows down into the brain stem and then ultimately into the spinal cord and the optic nerve, the simplest structures with the least additional pathways. And so I visualize this as the topographical model as a pool of reserve. So some people, this may ring a bell. They may have seen this leaky pool model, um, which is how it is often called. And imagining this pool of reserve with the deep end of that pool for the hemispheres of the brain and the shallow end of that pool for the spinal cord and the optic nerve. And the lesions that appear in multiple sclerosis are depicted in this leaky pool as topographical peaks, these white little mountains under the surface. So anyone who's ever seen a topographical map, it's a map of sort of peaks and valleys, the highs and lows, usually mapped this way to show regions with mountains and valleys. And in the topographical model of MS, it's a way of saying the location of lesions matters. Where a lesion is so important in terms of whether it does cross the threshold and cause symptoms or not, and how much reserve is there protecting that person from that lesion. And so in neurology, as you know, and any neurologist listening know, we talk a lot about localization, right? Where a lesion localizes to based on the findings and the symptoms that it causes. And in this concept, the topographical model, topography is just location. It's location on that map of the central nervous system. And it's a way of saying that lesion location matters, reserve matters, and what makes MS unique, I think, one of the things, is that everyone's pattern is a little bit different. But how many lesions someone has and where they are, if they are principally in the spinal cord, for instance, and how much reserve someone has, how full is their tank or their pool, and how fast is that pool draining? How fast is that reserve going down as the years pass? I think that really determines to a great degree what someone's journey with MS is going to look like. Now, you mentioned the phenotypes of MS, which is my boss and mentor's work, Fred Lublin. So these are the Lublin phenotypes, which we've had now for 30 years, characterizing MS as relapsing remitting, secondary progressive when someone's relapsing remitting disease starts to progress more gradually, or primary progressive MS, as you mentioned, where someone has progression of neurologic findings and symptoms, but never had relapses. My view is that those three things are really not distinct entities. So people have long asked, what kind of MS do I have? It's a very reasonable question. You Google multiple sclerosis or look at the Wikipedia page or look at the National MS Society, the European MS Agency's educational platforms. They talk a lot about the phenotypes. They are important. But I think that what those don't capture are some of these nuances, some of these distinctions that make someone who has relapsing remitting MS have had a rough time. But someone else that we might call secondary progressive might not have had such a rough time. So we like to think of it as, relapsing remitting MS is more mild and progressive MS is more severe, but I think it's much more complicated than that. And in the language of the topographical model of MS, there is no real distinction between them. It's simply a question of how many lesions has someone had that crossed the threshold and caused relapses, and how full is their tank of reserve and how fast is it draining? That is to say, how much, if any, progression has that person experienced? And our goals are twofold: treat the disease to prevent new lesions, prevent those topographical peaks, keep the disease topography, as I call it, as flat as possible, and also boost reserve, keep the tank full, foster repair and renewal so that that person can keep their disease below the threshold. And as you've said, keep living above it.
Yeah. I have to just add, Stephen, that at the biology level, the typing of MS, there's no difference between the primary progressive, secondary progressive, relapsing remitting. At the biology level, it's more or less the same. And we also got this smoldering MS concept. Again, it's just an indicator of the progressive nature and diffuse changes that conventional tests and measures are not capturing in a given time. And I think the other aspect I would like to mention that Leitman, one of the scientists, he uses the concept of above the threshold, which suggests that people with MS can tolerate certain degree of lesion load without manifesting to clinical symptoms, as we just discussed and you explained nicely. I think it's just, scientific evidence of that. And looking at your own research, Prof. Krieger, is that you mention in many of your articles that how sub-threshold disease activity can remain undetected in patients with EDSS scores such as 0, for example. What do you think about, when somebody comes into your clinic and they read the SS is 0, how do you really evaluate their capacity and brain reserve? Do they have enough function to compensate things, and do we capture the reserve in our clinical setting? Some people may physically be well, they really fail at their work with their working capacity.
It's a great question. And I think, our patients have been telling us for years that they know that they're worse, or they know that the MS is causing something for them. And we, neurologists, will do our basic exam and perform a basic MRI scan, and we're reassured because we don't see anything new. But if a person is telling me that she's worse, um, in some way she's worse. And the question is, are we good enough to pick it up? Are we good enough to see it? Are we looking in the right place? Are we looking in the right way? And how can we look a little bit harder? So the EDSS zero paper, I'm glad you brought that up. It's kind of a niche title. EDSS zero is not normal. I mean, that's really kind of a joke, but it's an in comment to neurologists and people who do MS research, for whom the EDSS is our disability scale and zero is defined as normal. EDSS is defined as no findings. And what we did, again, with my colleague Jim Samowski and his cohort that he's assembled of people with early MS in whom he's studying reserve. This is called the Radiums cohort, RADIEMS. He's published a few things from it, including this paper on EDSS zero. What we did is to use more challenging tasks. So instead of just the simple, what we call a mental status exam, which is essentially, remember a couple of objects and know who the leader of your country is and what day it is, we ask much more challenging cognitive questions and cognitive tests. So one could use even quick things like the SDMT, which is can be done rather briefly, and it's not a very involved test, but it's a good cognitive screening test. And then, for instance, as I said earlier, reserve is not just limited to cognition. So for strength, instead of just, what we do in the office, push my arm and squeeze my hand, we would test strength with a dynamometer to look at true grip strength, maximal power. Instead of, for balance, asking someone to just walk a couple of steps of tandem walk, heel toe walk down the hall, we ask people to do a heel toe walk on an elevated beam with their arms folded across their chest. It was challenging. No one was injured, but it was challenging. Um, you get the idea. So a series of more challenging assessments. And what we found is that the people with an EDSS of zero, a normal neuro exam, still had findings. The MS had still caused things that were just under the threshold. But when we looked harder, we could see them. And these often go along with what our patients tell us. And so the mandate of that paper was not that we have to do EDSSs on everyone or that we must do these particular challenging tasks, but the mandate, the call to action, I think, for neurologists is to say, how can we look harder at our patients? How can we look more carefully? How can we challenge them a little bit? As you said, to gauge how much reserve someone has or their true burden of disease under that threshold. Um, and, for a long time in our field, things like silent progression has been a topic, and symptoms that are often called invisible symptoms are a topic. And what I've tried to say based on that work is progression's only silent if we're not looking very carefully.
Yeah,
And symptoms are only invisible if we're, not looking. Uh, so I feel like we have to listen harder and look harder at the people we take care of and believe them when they tell us that they're struggling.
absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think we also have to admit our conventional assessment or neurology assessment is very, very limited. And in particular, when we're addressing EDSS, which is a common practice, it's a good communication tool between the neurologist to explain the clinical situation, whether patient is disabled, saying EDSS 6, or somebody's got milder form EDSS 4. But the accuracy of this measurement is really, really limited. And we need to go beyond EDSS and look for alternative measures to identify the underlying um, pathology. And I think what is also important, the interplay between the above and below threshold dynamics just illustrates how individuals with varying level of the brain reserve can experience different clinical trajectories despite the similar level of the lesion burden. I think that that's probably a summary of our sort of discussion here. But I would like to maybe quickly touch the how does the brain reserve interacts with the disease modifying therapies or other treatments that we have available. um, do we have any new strategies to boost the brain reserve with these therapies? What are your thoughts?
And I'll be curious about your thoughts on this too. So I think, our disease modifying therapies are very good at preventing new lesions, preventing relapses from occurring. In a sense, I think of our treatments, our disease modifying therapies, as doing most of their work on the base of the topographical model, preventing those lesions from rising up at all. And as I think I said earlier, trying to keep the disease topography as flat as possible. No areas of damage that could later reveal themselves above the threshold if reserve declines, if that tank of reserve does drain over the years and decades. But I do think that there are data that our disease modifying therapies do preserve brain volume to a significant degree. And it makes sense. Even if these medicines don't penetrate into the brain and foster brain health themselves, they're keeping the immune system bad actors that are trying to cause MS lesions out. They're preventing all those hits and damage to that nervous system. And I think every lesion that's prevented not only helps to prevent more disability later, but it also helps to preserve brain health and brain integrity. Um, what our medicines don't do yet is actually, I think, boost reserve. I don't think we have medicines. I'll be curious to see if you agree or disagree with this, but I don't think our medicines yet have been shown that they actually boost reserve. So when I talk to the people I take care of, I try to frame it as we'll do one thing with the disease modifying therapies. We'll prevent lesions, we'll keep the disease topography as flat as possible. But then what can she do? What can he do to boost reserve, to be well, to have a healthy lifestyle? Because I think those things are actually really crucial for brain integrity. And it's not just lip service. Why does quitting smoking alter the trajectory of someone's MS disease? It is the single most useful thing someone could do, I think, to alter that disability likelihood over the years. And I think in part it's because it, it's a neurotoxin. So smoking is poisoning the brain slowly and quickly, and it causes vascular disease to the brain and other hits to that brain. So taking that out of the picture allows that brain to be healthier, to restore itself, to heal in ways that it wouldn't have otherwise. It helps to keep the tank full. And so, I've told plenty of people over the years to quit smoking. It's hard. That's the whole point. It's designed to be really hard to quit smoking. But when framed in that way, this is the most impactful thing someone can potentially do to preserve brain health, to keep the tank of reserve full. My hope is that that's a more empowering message. And then we can talk about a whole array of other ones that I think are
Yeah.
important to you in your work, that I think also we can put in terms of filling the tank.
Yeah. Just to add, Stephen, I totally agree that there is a power of the disease modifying therapy, in particularly, diminishing the new lesion load within the brain. And if we look at the studies and real world experience, people who present with a radiological isolated syndrome and clinical isolated syndrome, there is a risk of conversion. The large amount of the clinical events or radiological, let's say, events they had on their brain structures, that's a predictor of worsening of MS, and it only reinforced the idea that exceeding the certain lesion threshold can lead to clinical progression. How to achieve that is a holistic approach. So I'm a great advocate for starting disease modifying therapies and early, very early at the very beginning of the disease. And if you combine that with a lifestyle approach, I think it's no brainer. I think it's top notch way of managing multiple sclerosis or any chronic neurological disease. If you can combine the modification therapy with lifestyle therapy, because lifestyle
Well,
is disease modifying as well.
I was going to say it's disease modifying and it fosters brain health in general. I mean, I think this is, for instance, where diet figures into well-being in multiple sclerosis. I personally don't think that dietary modifications necessarily address the risk of new lesions, the risk of new relapses. We could disagree, but I don't think that's where it has its power. I think the disease-modifying therapies have their power in preventing lesions and relapses. What diet does is it fosters brain health. So my colleague, Dr. Alana Katzand, has done a lot of work with the Mediterranean style diet, the MIND diet, towards fostering brain health, addressing clinical symptoms. She and Jim Samowski, together with this cohort, have shown that adherence to the Mediterranean diet can foster cortical thickness and cortical integrity. So earlier you mentioned how cortical atrophy can be a marker of progression.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The tank is draining, and using a heart healthy and brain healthy diet like the Mind diet that Katzand has done so much work on, um, I think really supports that. And along with related things like managing body mass index and other sort of diet and vascular risk factors like elevated cholesterol and elevated blood sugar, all of these through vascular mechanisms and others can poison the brain. And in MS, we've got enough of an issue trying to keep the immune system from damaging the brain. All of these techniques fill the tank towards ensuring that the brain is not harmed in these other routes as well.
Absolutely. I think we could spend hours talking about the lifestyle, but I think it's worth addressing the areas that have got the main research evidence, and I think emphasizing the importance of the exercises, and how does that help to preserve the brain and the capacity. So what's your thoughts, and what's the research behind to support that? What
Yeah.
do you think about exercises?
A physical therapist that I've worked with who has devoted his career to multiple sclerosis will point out that it is never too early in MS to start a physical therapy regimen. And it is never too late in MS to continue a physical therapy regimen. That is to say, throughout the lifespan and throughout someone's journey, what physical therapy, and I would add to that occupational therapy, and for suitable folks, speech therapy, foster new pathways, workarounds, regeneration, what we term neuroplasticity. It allows people to navigate around the topographical peaks, if you want to use that metaphor, fills the tank, allows you the stream to get around the pebbles, if you want to use that metaphor. It puts up more cell phone towers so that the signals can get through more strongly, if you want to lean on that metaphor. But in all regards, what these approaches do is they optimize brain function, even if we can't see it on an MRI scan. I don't need to see it on an MRI scan. If I know that somebody is struggling with gait, for instance, because of MS-related weakness, and often that might be weakness in the hip flexors, so trouble lifting the leg, weakness in the foot dorsiflexors, so trouble elevating the toes, that feeling of foot drop, that feeling of dragging a leg as though walking underwater or walking through mud, that feeling. Physical
Yeah.
therapy can target those weak muscle groups, can bring back strength and resilience to the exact muscle areas that are weak, that are causing the problem. It can be targeted and can allow that to get stronger by getting more of the signals to those regions. And we see it all the time. And so I absolutely encourage that. There's lots of nice data, but not the sort of randomized clinical trial data that we have for disease modifying therapies, but that's okay. Some things we
Mm.
need that kind of data for, and some things, honestly, we don't. And this is one that I'm happy to recommend to people based on the data and just the clinical experience that I think we have.
Just some of the studies to list. One of the key studies by Samovsky and Levitt, that while MS patients cannot increase their genetically determined maximal lifetime brain growth, they can preserve their existing brain reserve through the brain healthy lifestyle. That includes physical activity, healthy diets, and adherence to disease modifying therapy. Prescribing medicine is one thing, but adhering to the therapy, it's an entire different topic. So we have to encourage people, if you are prescribed disease modifying therapy, don't forget you are committed to to administrate or to come and have your appointments and have the medicine as prescribed by your own neurologist. So going back to the lifestyle, these kind of interventions aim to maintain cognitive function and the integrity in people with MS. And there are so many other studies suggest that active cognitive reserve influences the link between the regional brain atrophy and cognitive function, increasing the neuroplasticity, as Prof. Krieger mentioned today. Systemic reviews highlighting the regular physical activity has anti-inflammatory properties and can improve biomarkers associated with the cognitive function in MS. There is an element of the neurotropic factor, which is being stimulated whilst you exercise. It's a special protein that plays a crucial role in the health, survival, and the function of neurons, which is our cell of the brain, in the brain and nervous system. Think about that exercises is like a fertilizer for the brain, helping neurons to grow, stay healthy, and form the strong, reasonable connections within your brain. So it's super important. But also, I would like to spend a bit of time talking about sleeping and the impact of good quality of sleep on the cognitive function. From many studies I read before, lack of sleep and insomnia is linked to dementia. And I'm pretty sure it has got a negative impact on the brain reserve if people are not sleeping. So it's another focus. What do you think about the good quality of sleep, Stephen?
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and we've talked in our field about MS fatigue, and you mentioned it earlier as a manifestation of the drained reserve. Because if you think of it, MS, in order for someone with MS to do what they set out to do, their signals have to traverse a windier path than someone who doesn't have lesions, right? If they've had neuroplasticity and regrowth and physical therapy and the such to get the signals where they're going, those signals nonetheless have to take new pathways in order to get there. And anytime a signal has to take a whole bunch of new pathways to get where it's going, it uses more energy to do that. And so I think it burns more gas, to use that metaphor, to get there if there's roads closed and detours. So it stands to reason that people with MS will burn through their energy more quickly than somebody without this disease. And so you're absolutely right. Sleep deprivation is brain toxic. Sleep
Mhm.
deprivation has been shown to be a risk factor for dementia. In MS, where there's the risk for cognitive symptoms, where there's this extra use of energy and running out of energy, you could imagine that sleep deprivation is going to be all the more harmful, all the more deleterious, because on a day-to-day basis, the brain needs sleep to restore itself, to consolidate memories, and to rebuild reserve. To be philosophical about it for a moment, or to sort of take a step out of MS, I think when I talk to people about sleep, sometimes they're sort of say, okay, well, yeah, I've always been a bad sleeper, or oh, well, I like to watch TV until 3 o'clock in the morning. And I try to help people to understand why it's important. So to be philosophical, let's just think about it for a second. Human beings are the most incredible creature on this earth. Let's face it, right? We have incredible skills and abilities. Our naturally created brains have allowed us to create civilization, land people on the moon, right? Do incredible things. And yet, every day, every person becomes unconscious, totally helpless, and lays there for hours, helplessly, and then wakes up in the morning to conduct ourselves. If you had to design a creature, right, and you wanted it to survive all the threats, all the harms, all the predators on this earth over the course of its evolution, you would definitely not design that creature to be completely unconscious and incapacitated and helpless for 8 hours a day. So sleep is so important that we created the family structure, society at large, to protect people while they sleep from all of the potential risks and harms. We created society so that we could sleep peacefully and survive to have children and go on and propagate the species. So, in essence, everything about our lives has been created to allow us to sleep because our brains need it so desperately that we're willing to take those sorts of risks of annihilation. So, with that in mind, I encourage people to not watch TV until 3 o'clock in the morning because they really don't need to. But what their brains really do need is sleep in order to restore itself, stay healthy, and function effectively across the lifespan. I hope you don't mind my brief digression into all of human history here, but I do think it's relevant.
It's important, absolutely. To the audience who are listening at the moment, think about how do you feel when you had a good night's sleep? How can you cope with the same task that you had the day before when you had a bad quality of sleep? So the entire another episode talking about the sleep hygiene and sleep quality and how to get into the deep sleep and have a good quality of sleep. But just to look at the research, and we have loads of evidence saying that the good sleep, it's almost like orchestrating neuroplasticity, actually refining cortical plasticity, which is our higher cognitive function and thinking processes and executive function, and restoring the whole performance. So, there's nothing more and more beautiful in this life than healthy, thick, good volume brain. And to end, I think stress management is super important. A lot of people are not sleeping because they feel overwhelmed, stress, and lack of sleep, poor quality of sleep has got increased risk of obesity. So people then have struggles with managing their weight, So it's a vicious cycle. It's quite catch 22. Smoking at nighttime, eating throughout the night, not stopping, bad habit formation. It's enough to have 2 meals a day. We don't need to binge. We don't need to snack in between. And certainly we don't need to wake at 2 a.m. and have chocolate or something that is exciting and it gives you a lot of sugar, but that keeps you even further awake. So just be mindful about this, and we're not going to go too deep into smoking. It has got super negative effect on the brain health, brain volume, increases the disability significantly, and there are so many meta-analyses and strong studies to suggest that. Any advice how to give up smoking, Stephen?
Oh,
Any
I don't know if I have the best advice on it. I think different things do work for different people, but I think the most important thing someone needs in order to quit something is the reason, the motivation, the rationale to do it. Because without that, I think all the techniques are not so likely to help. So that's why I talk a little bit about smoking cessation as one of the most important things someone can do to keep their tank full, to keep their reserve up, that along with the other things we've talked about. Um, Thankfully, in a lot of places, smoking has sort of gone out of style. So epidemiologically speaking, it's an easier pitch, I think, to make now in many places than it used to be, but not everywhere. But I'll tell you, I'll give you one example in that respect. I mean, I've told a lot of people to stop smoking over the years, but a young woman came to see me in New York from Brazil, from Sao Paulo, some years ago, and maybe it's because she journeyed such a long way for the consultation and because so much, I think, was riding on it for her at that moment in her MS journey that, I met with her, I met with her family. One of the things I said was, well, you should really stop smoking. And I said, I know that that's probably going to be hard at that time in Sao Paulo. Smoking was still part of the culture, and it had already changed in New York, but there, that was a difficult ask. So she left, and a couple of years later, she came back to see me for a follow-up visit, and I inquired about that. I said, "Well, have you given any more thought to stopping smoking?" Very non-threatening question. I always feel if I'm going to be a doctor who's asking someone to give up something that they enjoy, the last thing I want to do is be a scold about it. So it was a gentle question. And she said, "Well, yes, I stopped smoking." I said, well, when did you do that? That's terrific. She said, well, the day you told me to. The day you told me to stop smoking, I never smoked again, she said. And she went back to Sao
Mm.
Paulo, and now she's telling all of her friends that they also should stop smoking. And she's, a little one-person public health campaign there in Brazil. And what I realized about that is, I think the reason she took it seriously coming from me is because she placed so much emphasis on what I had told her. She traveled a long way. It had meaning. And by my telling her that, she felt that it had a real mandate for her. It was valuable. It gave her a reason. And and so I always feel like, well, if I could convince her, I can try to convince others. And so I tell that story here because maybe it'll resonate with some people that are listening. Maybe she's listening. She influenced me in that way because I think that that was a very powerful change for her wellness.
Wonderful story. And I think in adversity, living with MS is already quite a challenging condition to deal day to day. And I think in that situation, you can become healthier you. And I heard some stories that young people who are being diagnosed with MS in their 20s, they become super healthy and they become healthier than their peers.
Yeah.
And they go to the parties and they don't drink too much. They don't smoke, they just, they run marathons and they look after their bodies because they're very focused on their brain health and brain reserves. If you are 20 years old at the moment and you're going to be in your 70s and 80s, majority of people who don't have MS, they not necessarily look after their general health. And you may end up that in your 70s living with MS, you're much, much healthier than your peers because by this time moment, they will have diabetes, high blood pressure, dementia, obesity, so all these comorbidities. But because you looked after yourself and looked after your brain reserve and water tank, so you're gonna be fit, despite this, condition that you have to live with. But
That also brings it back to the savings account example that you gave earlier, the savings account metaphor for reserve. Who is it that's not really taking care of their savings account and putting their money away? 20-year-olds who are not worrying about retirement, but that 20-year-old who is told, invest early, put money away, plan for your future, plan for your retirement when you're young, that's the person that ends up wealthy. And in this respect, that's the person that ends up healthy with an actual, healthy brain later in life because they've done the work to fill their tank over the course of their whole journey.
there is nothing more precious in this life than healthy brain. Let's talk about the misconceptions. So, a lot of people now listening is like, okay, can I beat MS? Does it mean like now because I'm having a brain reserve perfect at this stage, can it help me to delay progression? Can you cure MS with by preserving the brain health?
I think we want to foster optimism and empowerment, um, but not complacency. Right. So none of these things that we're asking for people to do or think about doing are easy. And I think when people understandably want a cure for something or a fix for something, um, it's kind of like wanting us as medical people or as just people living our lives to be able to flip a switch and the thing is done. And we don't have that yet. And I view it as you said earlier, a holistic strategy, which is there are things that the person can do for their health and well-being and their brain health and reserve, but there's absolutely a place for the targeted immunotherapies that teach the immune system in very specific ways to stand down and not continue to cause relapses and lesions and cortical damage over time. I don't think we can accomplish that by boosting reserve alone. That's why in the topographical model metaphor, there's really the two things. We can use our targeted immune therapies to prevent these new peaks from forming and rising up, these new lesions. And we can do all the things we're talking about together to empower people to keep their tank full, but neither one is sufficient alone. I wouldn't have somebody on a disease modifying therapy and think that they don't need to do anything to preserve their reserve. And I wouldn't have anybody, who wants to stay healthy and well with MS, doing all sorts of good things, diet and exercise and therapy to preserve their reserve, but then leave the lesions unattended, leave the risk for new relapses, you know, unchecked by not having them on a disease modifying therapy. I really do think these two things go in tandem. And I think we need to encourage the people we take care of to have realistic expectations of both. Um, this is not a solved problem yet.
Yeah,
I hope that in the
totally.
course of our careers and the lives of especially of our younger and middle-aged patients, that this will become something much more akin to a solved problem. And I think there's real reason to be optimistic there about where our field is going.
Yeah.
But I don't think I would want someone to be complacent about that now.
No, no, not at all. How can MS patients advocate for themselves during the consultations with neurologists about brain reserve? What specific questions should they ask?
Well, I think we've actually touched on a lot of the strategies, So sometimes I'm encouraging my patients to have physical therapy. Sometimes they're asking me to write them referrals for physical therapy, which I always smile and because that's great. I want someone to come and say, "Could I get some more physical or occupational therapy?" That's great. Um, I think that when I talk to people about disease modifying therapies, in essence, what we're talking about is treating their future selves, right? Treating to prevent things from happening in the future. And sometimes that can take up all the time in a visit. We're talking about MRI scans, we're talking about treatments, risks of treatments, the monitoring of the treatments, all this stuff about future you. And the person now and how they're feeling now gets kind of marginalized, right? Pushed to the last 2 minutes of the visit. What about my fatigue? What about my bladder? What about my energy levels? What about my walking? What about my cognition? All the things, and many more that I didn't just mention. And I think it's important for people with MS to advocate for themselves in the room to make sure that their neurologist is not just looking at the MRI scans and protecting future them, but actually helping them now. What can we do for the person now? And that is symptom management and lifestyle modifications and wellness endeavors, et cetera, and medicines as needed for some of these symptoms. But I care a lot about symptom management because I think it often gets overlooked. And I think I would tell your listeners to advocate for themselves in that respect to make sure that the way MS is affecting them now is not being overlooked.
Yeah, totally. I think it's important that education and what we're doing today is educating people with MS to think, reflect, and learn about their brain function. I think that's super powerful. Once people understand the processes, they can enhance their self-management strategies, whether that involves changing lifestyle, whether it involves building the resilience to the stresses, etc., etc. So I feel like we are together as a team coming here to talk. It is a highlight for majority. And when they next time going to go and see their neurologist, they might bring this topic and say, what about my brain reset? What do you think? How can I enhance that? What are the other tools or interventions I could implement into my day-to-day living? Nothing is more engaging in this world when we're dealing with a chronic condition such as MS is personalizing patients' journey. So what suits to Mary's, Tom, Sue doesn't necessarily it resonates to some other people who already may be running marathons, etc. So I think a lot of people these days, when they come to my clinic, they say, yeah, I've got a bit of a cognitive problems, some word finding difficulties, putting the words in the sentences, formulating the sentences, forgetfulness. And it's been highlighted by my family members. What should people understand about how brain reserve changes with aging process? and its connection to MS progression, because some people refer to me saying, "Oh, I think it's probably aging, it's not a great difference to my partner." But at the same time, science suggests that with MS, people have premature aging process, and where does this brain reserve concept stands in the aging population living with MS?
I think it's a great question, and it's a question that speaks to the success we've had in our field that people with MS are going to live nice, long lives into late adulthood and their elderly years. And we're going to have to distinguish between, is it the MS or is it getting older? Is it the MS or is it mild cognitive impairment or even early Alzheimer's disease, which is, of course, even more common in the world than multiple sclerosis. So as people with MS get older, they're likely to experience that too. There's a lot of work that's being done now on understanding the lifespan in multiple sclerosis and brain aging. So there's been work done looking at brain aging from an imaging perspective. Um, Dr. Jennifer Graves in California in the United States is doing work on telomere length and biological aging to try to distinguish getting older from multiple sclerosis itself. But your question relates, I think, specifically to the neurocognitive domain, and that's really where a lot of the neuropsychology work is being done to tease out what is related to aging and cognitive impairment and what may be related to multiple sclerosis. My colleague at Mount Sinai, Dr. Sarah Levy, she's a neuropsychologist who's interested in that question, and she's starting a study to try to distinguish mild cognitive impairment from MS-related cognitive change, both with biomarkers and with nuances of neuropsych testing and the findings there, because the findings of cognitive impairment from MS might seem like normal aging or mild cognitive impairment, but they actually take on a different pattern. So she's doing work to kind of tease that out. And what I would say to a patient is have some neuropsych testing done to try to parse that out, because the implications for MS cognitive dysfunction and that of aging and mild cognitive impairment may be quite different. The strategies and coping mechanisms that a person will need to thrive may be different. The way their family members need to assist them and help them navigate their day and their tasks may be different depending on what's found there. So I think having someone who's getting older with MS, with or without apparent such cognitive and behavioral challenges, should try to have some neuropsych testing to tease that out.
That's a formal way of assessing cognitive function. But just to add to the whole bucket here, that cognitive function is very complex, and people with MS quite often are emotionally affected. So, an anxiety, depression can affect the cognitive performance. People may be more forgetful, not focusing on things, and that affects their performance day to day. And of course, lack of sleep, as simple as that, also can affect but it's not necessarily driven by the underlying MS pathology. If there are other multiple factors influencing your day-to-day living. So, and to answer that question, yes, we need more research and then some formal assessment and measures to identify what's aging, what's MS related, what's the environmental impact on your day-to-day performance. Moving and wrapping up, I think we need to finalize. We are discussing very, very important topics here, and we are covering most of the fields in MS, to be honest, during this one single episode. But maybe we have to think about how can we finalize our thoughts here on this episode. Stephen, what excites you most about the future of MS care and research, especially in the context of the brain reserve?
Well, I think it's tempting to name particular research endeavors, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to say the following. What's exciting to me is the overall pace of change in our field. And one can see that in the way we treat MS now compared with 10 years ago. One sees that in the way our diagnostic criteria are evolving to use new technology, our biomarkers are evolving to give us more insight, the way our neuroimaging keeps getting better, and the way our therapies are going to keep getting better as well. So I wrap this up in the following way. And I don't say this to everyone, but I've said this to some of my patients, which is when someone's being newly diagnosed now, what I'm excited about is that I can tell her that I'm going to treat her with effective disease modifying therapies. We're going to get neuropsych assessments, comprehensive assessments, and start her on a brain wellness path. And that my goal is for our field to progress much faster than her disease. That her disease is going to be, in essence, if I do everything right, frozen in time, circa now when she's getting diagnosed. She stays constant, but our field keeps getting better. And as we keep getting better and better and better, I want us to get further and further out in front of it for her. That's the image I want someone with MS to have now. They're understandably so worried what's going to happen to them. I want them to understand what's going to happen to our field, which is we're going to have things that we don't have now in 10 years and again in another 10. And we're going to be able to do more for her in the future than we can even do right now.
This is so beautiful. It feels like you would like to stay as part of this someone's journey throughout the life. And that's super calming, um, revealing a lot of who you are as a physician, and encouraging people to have neurologists living lives, providing care the best they can, and stabilizing patients' condition and preserving their brain health. Today we discuss a lot of things. We start with metaphors, the analogy, philosophical observations, topographical models, below and above the threshold, and brain reserve. And we got into the lifestyle approach, and then giving advice to people how can they support themselves and preserve their brain capacity, and touching some lifestyle such as sleeping, good quality of sleep, good diet, exercise program, maybe playing the instruments, maybe playing the piano or guitar, or being part of the band, and all that increases the neuroplasticity, better networking, preserves the brain volume, and helps with the function. So Stephen, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your invaluable insights into brain reserve and MS care. You've given us not only a better understanding of the science, but also practical steps to empower ourselves and people who live with MS. To our listeners, I hope today's episode has left you feeling inspired and equipped to take charge of your brain health. Don't forget to subscribe to Be Well with MS on your favorite podcast platform, and share this episode with anyone who could benefit from learning about brain reserve. Don't forget to subscribe, www.bewellwithms.com. Until next time, stay curious, stay proactive, and remember, be well with MS. Take care. Thank you, Stephen.
Whew, that was good. That was long, but that was good.